What if I told you that most Christians are living far below their spiritual inheritance, trapped in a cycle of religious performance, while their true spiritual life remains dormant, waiting to be awakened? Right now, as you watch this video, there are believers all around the world who have discovered something that completely transformed their relationship with God, not through more church activities or Bible study programs, but through understanding 5 revolutionary principles that a humble Chinese brother named Watchman Nee unveiled decades ago, principles so profound that they continue to shake the very foundations of traditional Christianity today. Have you ever felt like there's something more to your spiritual life, something deeper than the surface-level Christianity you see around you, yet you can't quite put your finger on what's missing? Watchman Nee understood this spiritual hunger because he himself was once trapped in the same religious machinery that keeps millions of believers spinning their wheels, going through the motions of faith while their spirits cry out for genuine transformation. Through years of spiritual revelation and painful personal experience, he discovered that the Christian life isn't about trying harder or doing more. It's about understanding the fundamental difference between living from your soul and living from your spirit, a distinction that most believers have never even heard of. The tragedy is that countless sincere Christians spend their entire lives struggling with sin, feeling defeated, and wondering why their prayers seem to bounce off the ceiling, never realizing that they're operating from the wrong source of life altogether. They're trying to live the Christian life through their natural mind, emotions, and willpower, what Watchman Nee called the soul life, instead of learning to live from their regenerated spirit where Christ himself dwells. This confusion between soul and spirit has kept the church weak, divided, and powerless for centuries. But when you understand these 5 principles, everything changes. Picture this. What if you could wake up tomorrow morning and instead of fighting the same spiritual battles, struggling with the same sins, and feeling the same distance from God, you discovered that you already possess everything you need for victory, peace, and intimate fellowship with the Almighty? Watchman Nee proved through his own transformed life and the lives of thousands who followed his teachings that this isn't wishful thinking. It's the normal Christian life that God intended for every believer. These 5 principles aren't just theories or concepts. They're spiritual realities that will demolish every religious stronghold in your mind and introduce you to a dimension of Christianity that most people never experience. But here's what makes this even more urgent in our modern world of spiritual confusion, where everyone has an opinion about God, but few have encountered his transforming power. These timeless truths serve as a compass pointing directly to authentic spiritual life. When Watchman Nee was imprisoned for his faith and eventually died in a Chinese labor camp, he left behind a treasure trove of revelation that continues to liberate believers from spiritual mediocrity and religious deception. If you've been hungry for more of God, if you've sensed there's a deeper level of spiritual life you haven't accessed, if you're tired of Christianity that feels more like a burden than a joy, then these next few minutes could mark the beginning of your spiritual revolution, because you're about to discover the 5 principles that will shatter every limitation you've accepted about your relationship with God and unlock the abundant life that Christ promised to every believer. Have you ever woken up determined not to lose your patience, only to find yourself yelling before your morning coffee, or promised yourself you wouldn't compulsively check your phone, but ended up scrolling through social media for 2 straight hours? Watchman Nee lived through exactly these frustrations until he discovered something that completely changed his understanding of why we repeatedly fail in the same areas. He realized we possess 2 distinct natures operating simultaneously: our soul, mind, emotions, and will, and our regenerated spirit. The tragedy is that we try to live as Christians using only our soul, which is limited and flawed, while ignoring our spirit where Christ dwells with unlimited power. Think about the last time you lied to avoid a difficult conversation, or when you felt envious seeing a friend's luxurious vacation photos on Instagram. Those reactions sprouted from your soul, mind calculating advantages, your emotions reacting defensively, your will choosing the apparently easier path. But while that was happening, your spirit remained in perfect peace, connected with Christ, possessing all the honesty and contentment necessary for the situation. Watchman Nee discovered we don't need to strive to produce Christian virtues. We need to learn to identify and live from the correct source where those virtues already exist. Here's where it gets practical. When your spouse makes that comment that always irritates you, you feel the irritation rising. That's your soul reacting. In that moment, you have a choice. You can follow the irritation, justify it mentally, and respond with sarcasm or coldness. Or you can pause for a second and turn to your spirit, where Christ already possesses the patience and love necessary to respond constructively. It's not about suppressing irritation or pretending it doesn't exist. It's about choosing to operate from a different source of life. The difference between soul and spirit isn't philosophical memority, it's experiential and transformative. When you operate by the soul, you depend on your limited capacity to understand complex situations, control your unstable emotions, and make correct decisions with incomplete information. It's like trying to drive at night with only your car's headlights. When you learn to operate by the Spirit, you have access to Christ's perspective on every situation, his emotional stability, and his infinite wisdom. It's like driving in broad daylight. You see clearly what's ahead and can navigate with confidence. Our generation faces constant attacks against the life of the Spirit. Social media algorithms are designed to keep our soul hyperactive, always comparing, reacting, desiring, fearing. Dating apps reduce people to superficial profiles, feeding the soul's consumerist nature. Work culture glorifies productive anxiety, keeping our mind always accelerated. But Watchman Nee taught us that in the midst of this external storm, there exists an internal anchor, our spirit united with Christ. When you learn to connect with this reality several times a day, even for just a few seconds, your entire life begins to operate from a different dimension. How many times have you left a Christian conference inspired, bought all the recommended books, made elaborate plans to wake up early to pray, only to discover that 3 weeks later, you are back to watching Netflix until late and skipping morning devotions? Watchman Nee called this the spiritual roller coaster. They come endless cycles of inspiration and disappointment that characterize religious performance. He discovered we're trying to live the Christian life like a spiritual self-help project, setting goals, creating systems, and measuring progress, when in reality Christ didn't come to give us a program to follow, he came to be our life. Consider how you react when you sin. If you're operating by religious performance, you immediately feel crushing guilt, promise to try harder, maybe fast for a few days, or read extra Bible to compensate. It's as if you have a spiritual bank account that needs to stay in the black through good works. But the normal Christian life functions completely differently. When you sin, you recognize you failed to live by the life of Christ dwelling in you, confess simply, and return to operating from his life. There's no drama, self-flagellation, or spiritual recovery projects. Just return to the correct source. Religious performance always leaves you exhausted because it depends entirely on your limited resources. It's like trying to charge your phone by pedaling an exercise bike. Technically possible, but completely unnecessary when there's an outlet on the wall. You force yourself to love difficult people through mental discipline, try to be patient by counting to 10, or control your tongue by literally biting it. But the normal Christian life recognizes that Christ is already perfect love, infinite patience, and wisdom for every word. Your responsibility isn't to produce these qualities, but simply to allow Him to express them through you. Here's a practical test to identify whether you're living by performance or normal life. Observe your motivations. When you serve at church, are you trying to impress leadership or genuinely expressing Christ's servant heart? When you give money, are you calculating blessings in return or simply allowing Christ's generosity to flow through you? When you pray, are you trying to convince God of something or enjoying fellowship with Him? Performance always has a hidden agenda. Normal life is spontaneous expression of divine nature. The subtle danger of religious performance is that it can look very spiritual on the outside. You can have impressive prayer schedules, extensive biblical knowledge, and irreproachable behavior, but be completely disconnected from Christ's life. It's like an actor who has perfectly mastered a character, but never experienced the real emotions he's representing. Watchman Nee observed that many Christian leaders are masters of this performance. They can preach about love while being critical at home, speak about faith while constantly anxious, or teach about humility while jealously protecting their reputation. The normal Christian life, on the other hand, is characterized by authenticity. You're the same person in public and private, because it's Christ living through you in both contexts. There's something profoundly humbling about discovering that the area of your life you've always considered your strong point is exactly where God needs to work most deeply. Maybe you pride yourself on your intelligence until an obviously foolish decision exposes your limited wisdom, or you trust in your ability to maintain relationships until a conflict reveals selfish patterns you didn't even know you possessed. Watchman Nee learned that God uses these embarrassing exposures not to destroy us, but to free us from the prison of trying to keep our life functioning through our natural resources. He calls this brokenness motivings, not divine punishment, but spiritual surgery. I remember how Watchman Nee described his own brokenness. He was a brilliant young preacher, eloquent and admired, until God allowed him to be publicly discredited by other Christian leaders. His reputation was devastated, his followers abandoned him, and he found himself completely isolated and questioning everything. But it was exactly in this valley of humiliation that he discovered something precious. His identity no longer depended on being recognized, admired, or successful. Christ became his only source of value, meaning, and security. Brokenness didn't make him less effective. It made him infinitely more powerful, because now Christ could flow through him without competition from his ego. Brokenness rarely comes in the way we expect. It's not necessarily a dramatic tragedy or extreme suffering. Sometimes it's as simple as your teenager pointing out a character flaw you didn't want to admit, or a coworker receiving the recognition you thought you deserved. It might be discovering that your children don't see you as the hero you imagine yourself to be, or realizing that your carefully curated social media image doesn't reflect who you really are when nobody's watching. Each of these small deaths of the ego is an opportunity for Christ to become more real in your daily experience. Here's the beautiful paradox of brokenness. The more you stop trying to protect your image, the more authentic you become. When you no longer need to impress anyone, you can finally be real. When you stop defending your rights, you discover a freedom you never imagined. Watchman Nee observed that truly broken people are the most attractive to be around because there's no hidden agenda, competition, or need for validation. They simply are, and in that effortless being, Christ is naturally manifested. But brokenness doesn't mean becoming a doormat or losing your unique personality. It means your personality finally becomes a clean channel for Christ's expression instead of an obstacle. Your natural qualities, fallen from humor, intelligence, creativity, leadership, also don't disappear. They're purified and redirected to serve eternal purposes instead of feeding your ego. It's like the difference between a river that's been dammed to create a stagnant lake, unbroken ego, and a river that flows freely to irrigate an entire region, broken ego. The water is the same, but its impact is completely transformed. Have you ever noticed how some people manage to maintain peace in the midst of chaos, find hope in desperate situations, or love people everyone considers impossible to love? It's not because they have naturally calm personalities or were blessed with easy lives. Watchman Nee discovered that these people learned a secret most Christians never discover: how to access the source of life that Jesus placed within every believer at the moment of conversion. This source doesn't depend on external circumstances, mood of the day, or energy level. It's a constant stream of Christ's own life, available 24 hours a day. Think about the last time you faced a situation that required more patience than you naturally possess. Mighty and endless line at the bank, a child crying throughout an entire flight, or a family member repeating the same complaint for the 100th time. Your natural reaction probably involved growing tension, negative thoughts about the situation or people involved, and eventually an explosion or at least significant internal irritation. But imagine if, in the middle of that situation, you could simply turn inward and find a deep well of genuine patience. Not patience forced through gritted teeth, but natural patience arising from an inexhaustible source. Here's how this works practically. When you wake up anxious about an important presentation at work, instead of trying to control anxiety through breathing techniques or self-convincing, you stop for a moment and acknowledge, "Christ, you are my peace. You're not anxious about this presentation, so I don't need to be." It's not self-hypnosis or positive thinking. It's recognition of a spiritual reality. Christ really dwells in your spirit, and he really isn't anxious about your presentation. When you connect with this truth, anxiety naturally diminishes because you're operating from a different source. The inner life isn't something mystical or complicated. It's simply learning to live consciously in Christ's presence during normal activities. While you wash dishes, you can be aware that Christ is there with you, transforming a mundane task into fellowship. During a tense work meeting, you can silently turn inward and draw wisdom and grace from the inner life. In traffic, instead of getting frustrated with slow drivers, you can use the time to enjoy Christ's company. Every moment becomes an opportunity to experience divine life in common human contexts. What makes this revolutionary is that you stop being hostage to your external circumstances. Your mood no longer depends on the weather, other people's behavior, or your plans going as expected. Your emotional stability doesn't fluctuate with financial ups and downs, health problems, or relational conflicts. Watchman Nee lived this during years of imprisonment, where external conditions were deliberately designed to break the human spirit. But because he had learned to live by the inner life, he experienced joy, peace, and purpose, even in circumstances that destroyed other prisoners. It wasn't stoic resistance or forced optimism. It was genuine life flowing from a source that prison authorities couldn't touch. One of Watchman Nee's most shocking discoveries was realizing that most Christians, even the most spiritually mature ones, are trying to live the Christian life alone and failing miserably because of it. He observed that you can have profound experiences with God in your prayer room, but still explode with anger when someone disagrees with you in public. You might feel intense love for Christ during worship, but feel envy when a friend receives a promotion you wanted. These inconsistencies aren't character flaws. They're symptoms of trying to express Christ's infinite life through a finite and limited vessel. Christ never intended to express himself completely through an individual. He designed a body with many members. Consider how this manifests in real situations. You're going through a financial crisis and feel tempted to despair, but a brother in faith shares his supernatural tranquility about divine provision. And suddenly you can see your circumstances from Christ's perspective. Or you're struggling with forgiveness toward someone who hurt you deeply, but a sister demonstrates such genuine grace in her own similar situation that it awakens the same grace in your heart. These aren't just words of encouragement or good advice. It's Christ in one person, supplying what Christ in you needs to function fully. Authentic corporate life is radically different from participating in church activities. You can sit in the same pew every Sunday for 20 years, know everyone's names, participate in Bible studies and committees, but never experience true corporate life. This happens when Christians gather not just to hear sermons or fulfill religious obligations, but to mutually express the life of Christ, dwelling in each one. It's when your conversations naturally revolve around what Christ is doing in your lives. When you feel free to share real struggles, knowing you'll encounter grace instead of judgment. When needs are met before they're even verbalized, because Christ in one person is attentive to what Christ in another person needs. Here's where this gets practical and challenging. True corporate life exposes our individualism, disguised as spirituality. How many times have you prayed, asking God to change your spouse, children, or co-workers, but resisted when others pointed out areas that needed to change in you, or wanted the church to supply your spiritual needs, but got bothered when asked to contribute to others' needs? Watchman Nee discovered that spiritual maturity is measured not just by our personal growth, but by our willingness to allow Christ to flow through us to build up other members of the body. The ultimate goal of corporate life isn't to have a nice church where everyone gets along, but to create an earthly demonstration of how heaven functions. When believers learn to live in genuine unity, not forced uniformity or superficial cordiality, but unity that comes from Christ being expressed through diverse personalities. This becomes the most powerful testimony the world can witness. People observe not just transformed individuals, but an entire community where real forgiveness happens, where needs are genuinely met, where conflicts are resolved with grace, where different generations and backgrounds unite in authentic love. This can't be programmed or manufactured. It can only be experienced when Christ is free to express himself through a body of people who have learned to die to their individual egos and live for the corporate purpose. At this moment, as these truths echo in your mind, you stand at a crossroads that determines not only the future of your spiritual journey, but the legacy you'll leave for everyone who crosses your path. The 5 principles we've explored together aren't just interesting theological concepts or historical insights about a man who lived decades ago. They're golden keys to a dimension of Christian existence that most people never imagined possible. The distinction between soul and spirit, the difference between religious performance and authentic life, the transformative power of brokenness, the reality of inner life, and Christ's corporate expression. Each of these principles is like a piece of a puzzle that, when united, reveals a completely new portrait of what it means to be human, inhabited by God. Think for a moment about the person you were when you started watching this video and the person you are now. Something has changed. hasn't it? There's a holy restlessness growing in your heart, a hunger you might not be able to name yet, but that's calling you to something infinitely greater than the domesticated version of Christianity our culture offers. You can feel that for years you've been trying to quench your spiritual thirst with water drops when there was an entire ocean at your disposal. How many mornings have you awakened feeling spiritually empty, struggling with the same sins, wondering if there's more to this Christian life than endless cycles of guilt and effort? How many nights have you gone to bed knowing that despite all your religious activities, something fundamental was still missing in your connection with God? The urgency you feel isn't accidental. It's Christ himself calling you out of the safe and predictable religious patterns that keep you in spiritual comfort zones, but also in spiritual mediocrity. We're living in days where the difference between genuinely transformed Christians and merely religious people has never been so evident, and the world is desperately watching, hoping to see something real, something that transcends beautiful words and external behaviors. Your generation has a unique opportunity to demonstrate Christ's authenticity in a way previous generations didn't have. But this will only happen if you have the courage to abandon performative Christianity and embrace the inner revolution that Watchman Nee lived and taught. Imagine waking up tomorrow and for the first time in years, not feeling the crushing weight of trying to be good enough for God, because you finally understood that Christ is your goodness. Imagine facing that difficult situation at work and discovering that the necessary wisdom and patience simply flow from within you, without effort or tension. Imagine your most intimate relationships being transformed, not because you're trying to love better, but because Christ's own love is finding natural expression through your unique personality. Imagine being part of a community where people truly know and are known, where wounds are healed through authentic relationships, where Christ's life is so evident that others are attracted like metal to a magnet. This isn't spiritual fantasy, it's the normal Christian life that Christ died to make possible. But here's the truth that can change everything. You can't continue living as you've always lived and expect to experience something different from what you've always experienced. These principles we've shared today aren't information to store in your mind, but realities to experience with your entire life. The next step isn't more knowledge. It's surrender, not more understanding. It's application, not more inspiration. It's transformation. If something in your heart stirred during this journey, if you felt an echo of recognition when we spoke about authentic life versus religious performance, if there's a gentle voice whispering that there's more available to you than you ever imagined, then you're being invited to the most exciting adventure of human existence, discovering Christ, not just as your Savior, but as your very life. And if this discovery touched your heart today, I invite you to be part of this silent but powerful revolution. Like this video if it awakened something in you. Share it with someone who needs to hear these truths. Leave a comment telling how these principles are echoing in your journey, and subscribe to this channel so we can continue exploring together the inexhaustible depths of the life that Christ made possible for each one of us.